Reactive training systems.
Hey, welcome back to the RTS podcast. So, just recently I went to an NSCA regional conference. I got invited to go out there to be a presenter, and it was a really cool experience. The headlining presenter was Christos Iakovou, the famous Greek weightlifting coach, and I got to spend some time with him in addition to being present for his presentations, and it was really cool. I enjoyed my time there a lot. And so for today's podcast, I thought it might be cool for me to sit down with Mark and Ross and just kind of debrief what I picked up and just kind of have a more general conversation about the Greek weightlifting system, what I was able to learn from Christos Iakovou, and maybe even come away with some lessons learned. So figure out how this might apply to what we're doing in powerlifting coaching. So without any further delay, I'll bring you this conversation about Greek weightlifting and my lessons learned from the NSCA conference. So, anyway, I suppose we can try to get things going again here, but I just kind of wanted to sit down with you guys and talk about the NSCA conference that I went to a few weeks ago. It was a pretty unique event, and I don't know, I had some takeaways from it and just some general comments, I suppose, and figured we'd see where that takes us. Jed Smith was the organizer, and this was out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or near Cedar Rapids, I suppose. It was a rather unique event. You know, he invites people from all kinds of different areas of expertise, but his idea was in particular to give somebody a large chunk of time on the first day of the clinic, and then the second day of the clinic was, I suppose, more typical NSCA style, where you would have like hour-long presentations and stuff like that. And I guess kind of the headliner that he had this time was Christos Iakovou, who was the Greek weightlifting coach in the 90s and early 2000s when the Greek weightlifting team was really dominant. So he came and gave a presentation on how they teach weightlifting technique in Greece, and just kind of the way that they do athletic development, and then of course on programming too. I thought the athletic development piece was pretty interesting, right? So they talk about getting these kids in their program when they're really young, and I can't remember exactly how old. I want to say like 12 or 13, something like that, but in the beginning, just doing like broomstick technique work, and doing that for like 6 months. And then after that, they begin to load them a little bit, but they don't really load them that much for a couple of years, actually. And so this is all under direct supervision of a coach. And I think they keep them under like a perceived intensity of like 80% for the first 2 years. So after that, they allow them to start going heavier, and eventually up to maxes. And as they continue through their program, I made a comment on my Instagram that it seemed like Bulgarian style training with heart, whereas my perception, at least, of Abajayev and the Bulgarian weightlifting school was that, it was like max out every day, every session, and Abajayev would really push people and make them train and like really push them to the point of breaking, and he had the nickname the Butcher, and all this stuff. It sounded like a really hardcore training school. This was especially, I suppose after you got into like the sport mastery group, it was similar in terms of training structure, but had a little bit of a kinder, gentler approach to it. He was talking about how they would train in these 4-week blocks. So the first week would be something like working up to max singles. And then the second week, Mark, this will sound familiar to you. Like the second week was not quite as heavy, but more volume. And then the third week was really pushing the max singles. And then the fourth week, I believe, is a deload. And then they'd repeat the process, and then they would design these training blocks a month at a time. Although it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot to design, to be honest, because seems to be basically maxing out, heavy singles, not any really rep work. At least again, that's my perception of it, and they would just kind of continue in that way, until the athlete like reached a real pinnacle level in terms of their career. Yeah, I just thought, it's a bit interesting. Like they talked a lot about the coach needing to develop a good relationship with the athlete and understand the athlete and be friendly with the athlete and make the training fun, to the maximum extent that that's possible. They kept talking about that in Greece, it's sunny and warm and there's lots of things to do outside. So you have to give these athletes a reason to stay in the training hall, So it's kind of a departure from what I perceive from the Bulgarian school, Yeah, I just thought that was kind of an interesting description of like a national sports system,
Definitely. The thing, when I hear things like that, well, first of all, it's Olympic lifting, right?
Yeah.
It's all Olympic lifting. So I believe that's a lot more, technique is a lot larger part of that, of good performance. Let's say less strength and more technique weighted as opposed to powerlifting. So I can see where heavier singles, practicing technique with heavier singles would be more beneficial there. But
yeah, I agree with you. I definitely agree with you because that's how I write the training for all my athletes, right? Include singles, not as many as you would see in weightlifting by even a fraction, but it's technique work, benchmarking work, but the primary driver of the progress is the other stuff, whereas they take a different approach. I do think it's interesting, though, that so Christos apparently trains a few Greek powerlifters, and I got to sit down with him and just kind of have a chat at dinner one night, and he was showing me some videos of some of these powerlifters that he coaches, and they're strong dudes. And he says that he applies the same training philosophy to them as he does to his weightlifters. Perfect technique. He's a Puritan about technique, I would say, and lots and lots of just heavy weights, as heavy as you can, singles only, basically, just pushing high intensity all the time. I thought it was interesting too, like he was commenting about how his lifters don't develop big muscles, and it's just kind of an interesting thing to say because he framed it as though it's a benefit, right? Like, see, they don't develop these big muscles. You don't have to have all these big muscles to lift heavy weights. And I thought, that's interesting way to look at it, But
it really is, and I think there's a lot to that, for sure. Because there's, you've seen these guys that are tremendously strong, but if you just look at them, they're not that impressive.
Sure. Well, this calls to mind. So a couple things. One, going back to your comment about it being, weightlifting is different from powerlifting. It's important to note that these guys would train the squat the same way. At least the Greeks do, and I'm pretty sure the Bulgarians did as well. They would train the squat the same way. Really high intensity. And so he was talking about at the sport mastery level. So we're talking about Olympic caliber athletes. One thing that he's, I suppose, famous for is just the longevity of his lifters, and I could tell that he derives a lot of pride from that. Piros Dimas competing in 4 Olympic Games, which is unheard of, and lots of his lifters having long, successful careers as well. And he attributes that to, one, technical perfection, and two would be this sort of allowing them to deload periodically, which doesn't seem to be present in other similar systems. Again, just based on my understanding of it. But yeah, they're doing this with the squat as well, which I thought was interesting, and to the point where when they got up to that sport mastery level, he was talking about them training, 3, 4 plus sessions a day. Now, each session was 30 to 45 minutes, and it consisted of basically maxing out. So you would take a lift, it might be a snatch, but it also could be a squat, and you would max out. And if you made the lift, you would go up. And if you missed, then you'd try again until you missed. He said you miss a bunch of times, 3, 4, 5, even up to 10 times. And I'm thinking, like, good night. Think about like taking a squat attempt, your max squat, and then miss it, go until you miss, and then miss 10 times. That's nuts, And then go take a break and then come back in an hour, and then we'll do it with a different lift, and we'll do that 6 days a week. That's crazy,
I'd be interested. Did you talk to him about how he structures deload between these blocks?
I don't remember specifically on that. I mean, I've got the booklet here. I might ought to check that out, but it seems like it's pretty much the same thing. It's just lighter and less volume. I would be surprised if there were multi-rep sets, but you'd probably see easier work,
It's amazing he doesn't have more injured athletes. That's the reason I was asking that question. I mean, I can understand the technique part as playing a huge role, but even with great technique, just continually to pound a 1 rep max seems like a recipe for injury.
Yeah, you would think. What's that, Ross?
That sounds real scary. I mean, there's been times where I've missed a lift in training, trying to max out or doing near max effort, and I'm like, all right, I need to just correct this and redo it, and we'll be good. And it's like, dang, that second try felt a lot heavier than that first try. If I wouldn't have made that mistake on that first try, I would have been just fine. But now I'm like too shot to try it again.
Right.
So yeah, I couldn't imagine going more than 2 times, let alone all the way up to 10. And then turn around.
To be fair, like, I wonder if they're not dumping people into a program like that. That's the culmination of 15 years of preparation in that direction. There's no, getting distracted by, beach muscles for the summer or off seasons or anything like that. It's 15, 20 years of purely focused on, I guess it's closer to 10 or 15 years of purely focusing on this high intensity style of training, which starts off very gradually, and you ease into it. And then, I mean, I suppose from an overload standpoint, that kind of makes sense, right? Like if you develop yourself, you start off maybe just doing 80% for singles, right? Like we can all imagine doing that. And then you would gradually ramp that up over time as you adapt to it. And you're not getting stronger from that anymore. So you go to 85 and then 90 and then 95. And then, sooner or later you're maxing out, and then how do you continue to add load if you're unwilling to reduce the intensity in exchange for volume? Well, you just add more singles, Max Ada talks about this stuff a lot because he trained under Abajayev when Abajayev came to the States. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to have him on for a chat about this. Like I know he's talked pretty openly about it in other places as well. I think his perception of it now is that he would have fared better had he not done so much maxing out and spent some more time accumulating volume,
Mike, is there what else is there to this this sort of a protocol other than, I mean, is there secondary and supplemental? Are they doing that as well, or is it just pretty much competition movements heavy?
They don't include any bodybuilding work, if that's kind of what you're asking about. It was, in a similar vein to the Bulgarian approach. They're training the competition lift. I think they had some more movements than the Bulgarian model. They would include pulls in the earlier developmental stages. So for younger athletes, they would have pulls. And I want to say that they continue to include the power version, so power cleans and power snatches, even in later developmental stages. Whereas I think the Bulgarians trimmed that down so that they were kind of at the end, they were just doing snatch and clean and jerk and front squat. I think they even dumped the back squat after a time. But the Greeks don't seem like they ditched the back squat, and they seem like they kept the power versions as well. So, I mean, it's not exactly assistance the way that a powerlifter thinks of it, as like, doing some bodybuilding work, but it's also not the competition lift, I
mean, they're not say identifying weaknesses, weak ranges of motion, and trying to address them in individual athletes.
I mean, I think they do, but they probably see that more narrowly than, for example, how we would as powerlifters. The impression I get is that it's something like in this block, you've been having trouble with some aspect of your technique. So in this block, we're going to push more front squats, or in this block, we're going to push more jerks from boxes or something, things like that. It's not, I don't think they get as creative with the variations as, say, we might, it's an interesting approach. I mean, at the same time, like, this isn't something that powerlifters just haven't tried either. Like, we go through these mini obsessions with high intensity training. Seems like at least every decade, Bulgarian style training will get really in fashion for a while, and then it'll go out. And then it's max effort work, which is just, by a different name, and then it'll go out, So we've tried this stuff before. I don't know. I don't see people lining up at, the IPF championships who just spend a lot of time on absurdly heavy singles,
It probably has a lot to do with that technical component, though. I think if you're training powerlifting and you're sacrificing technique to move more weight on a max effort single, that carries more and more risk the further and further away you get from ideally perfect technique, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, it stands out, like one of the things that you said, how they get their lifters involved very early, very young, and it's just all technique for years and years, and I think that speaks volumes. I get that, like, we have there's a 80% heuristic, and it doesn't always have to be perfect, because at some point we want to be able to put more weight on the bar. But their idea of put more weight on the bar is a lot more larger macro scale than what we tend to think of as powerlifters. We want to put more weight on the bar during every single development cycle, every single week. We want to add 2.5, we want to add 5, but they want to do that over a much longer period of time, and they're winning that long game.
Maybe. I mean, this comes back to some ideas about technique for me that, I don't know, some things that I'm still wrestling with, on one hand. So for weightlifting, in particular, Olympic level weightlifting, you see kind of this enforcement, this top-down enforcement of certain technical standards. And, again, that was just mentioned how Coach Jacobu seems to be very particular about technique, I wonder how much of that is just kind of a selection survivorship type of thing. Like, yeah, that's the most efficient way to move the barbell, given how humans are generally built. So if you have the potential to be an Olympic caliber weightlifter, this will also be the most efficient way for you to move the barbell. However, if you're a more recreational lifter, like we see I talk about and share these pictures now and then of people with different hip architecture. And we know that some people can squat really wide, some people squat more narrow, that there's variability in ideal technique from lifter to lifter. It makes it difficult for me to see how this top-down enforcement of technique standards makes any sense, unless the whole point is that you've got this national system and you don't really care if you're going to get some people in the system that just don't have what it takes to get to the Olympic level anyway. So it's okay if those people get weeded out. The people that have what it takes will perform ideally with this certain technique. So the top-down enforcement of technique works and it makes sense. But that's not my job. Our job is to take whoever signs up for coaching with us and optimize things for them. So I wonder if, you start being overly rigid with top-down technique, if you you miss some folks. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. I totally get and understand that. I mean, and that's definitely, excuse me, a very real consideration for us. And I think that's a very good way to put it, in terms of how you say that they have like this national system, and if some people just don't make it, they just don't make it. Whereas we're very involved on the individual level of customization for the person, not necessarily for the nationalized system. But at the same time, one could say we still do, in a sense, weed some people out, because there's some people who don't want to do any auto-regulated training at all. They want to strictly train based off percentage, and well, that's not anything we're going to be doing here. We're not going to write percent-based programming. We'll have percent-based back-off volume, but not without some type of auto-regulated RPE indicator prior to that.
Generally, yeah.
I mean, there's at least some degree of that present in our own system as well.
Yeah.
And another thing that was running through my head listening to this too is you're talking about long time frames with the Greek system and the Greek team, decades. And that's different, if you got I think, realistically speaking, if somebody signed up for powerlifting coaching with us, they're not going to hang around for 2 years getting technique coaching. That's completely different scenario. So they're looking at the real long game. We try to do our best we can, obviously.
Just to maybe refine that idea a little bit. I don't think it's so much about the technique coaching itself, but just the fact that you're not really pushing the athlete for 2 years. That
right.
We're going to say, hey, 6 months of lifting a broomstick. Can you imagine running a CrossFit box where people come in and you say, we're just going to be working with a broomstick for 6 months? Heck no, man. People aren't going to stick around for that, and that was part of the conversation that we had as well. And it kind of seemed like, well, I don't care about that, which, hey, fair enough. If his thing is getting really, really good at this one particular skill, and he's figured out the way that he believes that this is best carried out, and we're saying, well, hey, that doesn't apply here to this other situation. What if you got really, really good at making pizzas, and you spent your entire life devoted to making the best freaking pizza that taste buds can taste, and somebody's like, yeah, that doesn't apply to making pies. It's like, fuck pies, I'm making pizza here. It's just not. So I can appreciate that it's not the same thing, but it's also a pretty significant problem to basically everyone else who might be trying to apply this system.
I think you just inspired a new career change, Mike.
A little lower stress, maybe. I don't know. Maybe it's higher stress. I don't know anything about making pizzas, man.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of work that goes into it, especially the right pizza.
But that is really, it's very interesting to me because, at whatever, almost 60 years old now, it's a big thing. It's really a big thing for me to look back and especially look at some of my fellow lifters like Tony Harris and David Ricks. And how are these guys hitting the numbers they're hitting and continuing to make progress after 25 or 30 years, Bo Moore, without injuries? How are they doing that? See, it's one thing, whatever, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Yeah. But when you're talking in decades, then there's something there, and if what is required is spending a lot of time getting technique just as perfect as you can get it, then if you're looking, if your goal is the long game and decades, then maybe that's the thing that needs to be done.
That's interesting, though, that you bring those two up, because all the respect in the world to Dave Ricks, but when I look at his squat, I'm always scared to death because it's not a very good looking squat. It's like the bar is always going up half sideways and cocked, and I don't know if that's like a newer thing in his career or if he's always kind of looked like that or not. I haven't ever seen any, I suppose, like 30-year-old or 25-year-old Dave Ricks squats before, so I've only seen his squats in the past couple of years, and obviously the guy's strong as hell and he's been doing this forever, and it's amazing. So if my thing where I go with that is like if perfect technique is this thing that creates that longevity, I don't see that there's perfect technique there. So maybe there's something there ought to be something else there too, aside from that.
I, I
we
100,
don't.
yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying, Ross, because I see the same things, with other high level lifters. Like, holy crap! And Mike, you and I talked about this uh, years ago. I think it was at the Colleen National Championships years ago. Who was the deadlifter? 220 class, deadlifting like 800 pounds with just, he was a chiropractor. I can't remember his name. Just make you cringe watching the deadlift. But he had this just ungodly deadlift. And, we were talking about why doesn't he get hurt? And it's just because best we could figure is because that's the way he's developed his deadlift over 10 years, 15 years, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that you're going to adapt to those technical deviations over time, and that's why I don't worry about them too much in the sense of. So let me back up for a second. I think that you'll adapt to the technical deviations that you've got. It's also true that the technique that you adopt is going to place stress on different structures. If you squat more upright, that'll take some pressure off of your back and hips and place more pressure on your knees, and vice versa. Really push your training to the absolute limit, then that it stands to reason that that would be the structure that would break down first. I mean, your body's made of materials, and materials fatigue with use. And if you exceed your capacity to adapt to the training, it makes sense that those are the structures that are going to fatigue and break down. So from a load management standpoint, I think there's kind of this intersection between the technique that you adopt and the load that you can tolerate. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that you can adapt to that. Kind of going back to talking about the longevity piece. I mean, we haven't done a ton of the top episodes yet, but every one that we've done, we talk to them about longevity, because so far we've been talking to active lifters. And I would say the common theme that I've heard so far amounts to temperance. It amounts to not doing crazy things all the time. That you've got your time where you're really pushing it, and then you've got other time where you're just kind of putting in some work. I think that's interesting too, and maybe that's where the technical perfectionism is an essential component if you're going to run this ultra high intensity type strategy. Maybe those two things are maybe you can't separate those two things.
So there's something that I think that kind of ties into that I'd be curious if you've noticed or observed that in the people that you've had in Titans of Powerlifting yet. But I think one of the things that always goes overlooked, I guess, or underappreciated in my opinion, is how a person handles and cares for their life stress away from the barbell and taking care of themselves in those sense. Are they always stressed out? Or are they always negative? Or are they always unhappy? Blah, blah, blah. Because, I think of somebody right off the top of my head that you've had on the podcast, like Susie. And Susie's always a really happy, upbeat, positive person. And I think that has a lot to do with what helps her in longevity. So, I mean, have you noticed a common theme in that with some of those Titans of Powerlifting? Or is there like a generalness of, you can tell that they're generally happy a lot in life and they're fairly stress-free or something along those lines?
I would say that they seem to have good coping mechanisms, as far as when it comes to stress. like they would be able to handle it well. It's like I'm thinking about Brad Gillingham, for example. Like he doesn't strike me as just a overly positive, optimistic person in the same way that Susie is. Like I mean, he's not a pain to be around by any stretch, but they're just not the same, in terms of temperament.
Right.
But they seem to be able to cope with that anxiety well, and that would reflect as well. Like if you think back to the Project Momentum where we had the people doing the personality test, the largest deviation that we saw from the median, from the mean. So the average score for the population is 50th percentile. The score that was the furthest away from the 50th percentile was neuroticism, and that was, I believe, the 35th percentile. So your average high level, very experienced powerlifter is lower in neuroticism than average. Feels less fear, stress, and anxiety than average. That seems to make sense. I mean, of course, exceptions abound, but in general, that seems to be the way things swing.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, we always talk about stress, fatigue, and recovery, and I mean, there is stress in life, and your body doesn't necessarily not feel that. Like it's going to feel life stress as it feels training stress, and need adequate recovery from both. And so if you don't have those coping mechanisms, which I like the way you put that, that's a much better way to put it than strictly labeling it as positive. That's too polarized, so to speak. But yeah, having those good coping mechanisms so that you're not super neurotic and you're not going crazy all the time, and you're able to deal with life as it comes along and roll with the punches and things of that nature. It's going to make a positive difference to your training. I think that's been a huge thing for me lately, in the past year or so, becoming better at that and being more efficient at that and having those coping strategies. And like physically wise, I know my body's felt better, pain-free, and less bumps and bruises and crap like that as the training goes along over the past several months to a year or so.
And we see that in your block reviews big time. Like we look at your block reviews, and it's been like since you've moved, it's been like, Ross, what the heck is going on, man? Like we're writing programs that we think should be successful, but it's surprising how successful they are. It's like, what's different here? And that change in environment is the biggest difference that we can see.
Right. But I think it's key there to note too, and take that a little bit further, that it's not necessarily the change in environment as far as like locating from one place to another, as much as it is to me the fact that for probably 2 years I'd really been wanting to and think about leaving Alaska and moving out of Alaska, but I wasn't doing that. I was always making up these stories and scenarios of why I couldn't do it yet, and why I needed to get to this point to do it, and I'd get to that point and I'd make up another reason why I couldn't do it yet. And so I was just fighting what I wanted and needed to do for myself. And then the second I would do what I want and need to do for myself, boom, like my body physically rewards me. It's recovered from that life stress.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I suppose the idea for me there is that the coping strategy in recovering from life stress is to kind of almost figure out what you're wanting and needing to do and do that.
I mean, there's a lot to that. Like people, me included, I guess, seem to be generally pretty bad at understanding what we want.
For sure.
It's more of a process of discovery than anything else.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's been a big positive change for me, is learning how to be more in tune with that and tap into that more. And that definitely helps. So Yeah, I would look at how that with longevity for those lifters, and how they're good with those things, and they're doing what they want to do and being what they want to be, and having those strategies to cope with life stress, paired with having good sound technique. I mean, I think of like Susie's squat, and her squats always, there's been times where I've handled her and helped her out at meets, and she'll like not do so good on her second, and she'll come off, oh, I just need to I have my foot just off a little bit, I'll fix it. And she'll go out and fix it and nail her third. And from a visualization standpoint, from the coach's box standpoint, like, it didn't look any different. It was just,
Yeah.
She was made the adjustment she needed to make the heavier load move.
Yeah.
So it's always fun to watch that in action.
I mean, that's another aspect of technique, right? That especially once you get to where you've been doing this for a few years, there's like these little subtle aspects of technical execution that just aren't available to anybody watching. It's you perceive more detail about your own technique than anybody could see watching it from an outside perspective, and that's why I kind of go round and round on these technical models from time to time, that it just doesn't make a whole ton of sense to me to have, these detailed technical models if it means that we're going to lose all the flexibility of individual differences, of self-experimentation. If we said, the right way to squat is with your toes turned out at a 30-degree angle, and that's because, most people are squatting this wide, and, this keeps this and that in alignment, and, whatever the reasons are, there are plenty of exceptions to that. And how do you begin to figure out if you're one of those exceptions or not? And that's the thing that I continually come back to whenever I'm thinking about technique, and like, how do you go about idealizing technique? How do you coach technique at a high level that goes beyond just saying, hey, I have this model in my head of this is what a squat is supposed to look like, and you did these things different. I think that that's where 99% of the people are when it comes to technical coaching. And I just don't think that there's a whole lot of just internal consistency with an idea like that,
Right.
I mean, technique is obviously important, but how do you get to the point where, you've got a good understanding of the precise technical interventions that this particular lifter needs,
For sure.
Well, and not only that, Mike, but I notice, like with myself, at least, that it changes from one, like say, for instance, one squat session to the next. If, say, my knees are a little sore or my hamstrings are a little tight, then my technique changes to accommodate that. Like, if my knees are a little sore, then I end up not with less knee flexion and more hip flexion, and it sort of changes the whole movement.
Yeah.
And is then the following week your hip's more sore than your knee?
Actually, yes, that has happened.
I was just curious, because then to me, like, if you compensate for one thing and then you overcompensate, then it makes the other side too sore, and like your pendulum's going back and forth, and like just try to settle in on that one spot and stay there. Obviously there's going to be some minor adjustments that in the pendulum, it's always should be swinging a little bit, I suppose. But if we're making big swings, I think that puts somebody at risk, and you overcompensate.
Absolutely. Like, here's an example that I'm trying to just recover from right now. So I was doing a lot of squat work. IT bands got really tight. Then my knees start to hurt a little bit. So then I overcompensate, like I said, less knee flexion, more hip flexion. Well, then that ends up putting more stress on my wrist flexors because the bar position is different. Then my forearms get dinged up. Yeah, 100% agree.
So wouldn't part of that longevity then on that pendulum and that compensation be like when you're feeling over here and like, oh, my knees are really sore, like we can't allow ourselves to overcompensate and we got to, keep it dialed in on that middle ground and try and use some other intervention in that situation rather than overcompensation?
Yes, I agree. And so let's go down that hole for a second. What would you do in that situation? Okay, you got super tight IT bands, your knees are aggravated, you're conscious that your technique has changed a little bit. You're in the midst of your squat workout. What do you do?
I would probably adjust the load and rating to match what I'm capable of doing in that within, like, if we have, a pendulum swing, say this big, and we know we can't overcompensate too far, try and narrow that down and train within that, in that zone based on the auto regulation, and like allow the ability to stay in that range. Like the second I start going outside that range, that's over on the RPE. That just added, just like how we say, say a lifter moves a by 1 at 8 squat and it moves a by 1 at 8. Well, it wasn't at depth, so it's actually now a 10 because it wasn't to the competition standard.
So you're saying that you sort of switched the RPE scale from reps left in the tank to pain. Let the pain level regulate RPE.
Yeah, not necessarily let the pain level drive it, but let your ability to maintain your proper movement pattern drive it. It's rate of perceived exertion. Exertion is part of your ability to maintain that position.
So just to maybe refine it a little bit, you could think of it like reps left with adequate technique, because we talk about that at times when people are having more serious technical issues that need to be corrected. If you've got a tendency for your butt to come off the bench, butt coming off the bench is a missed lift. So the essential question is, how many reps did you have in the tank to competition standard, not how many reps left in the tank could you do if you just went all out. I mean, you can throw in some other ideas there as well, right? Like you could foam roll and do some soft tissue stuff to help get the pain response down in the short term. But I don't know, man. I'm of the mindset. I mean, as long as we're not going just completely bananas with the technical changes, I think I'm okay with it. We're talking about a gradient problem in the sense that you're trying to pick a middle ground, right? So let's say your ankle is bothering you. So if you were to widen your stance and sit back a little bit more, there's less demand for ankle mobility and you can squat, but your ankle doesn't hurt, right? Well, you can take that too far and then you can jack up your hips and jack up your back and so on up the chain. But if you can just do a little bit, and yeah, maybe it's a little bit more taxing on your hips, but it's not gonna continue to bleed over into subsequent training sessions, then I think that's an exchange that's worth making, So I don't think you've got to go completely one way or another,
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I say I think, like, it's that swing of the pendulum and not making that swing so far,
right?
Keeping that in line here. If Mark, you've had this experience, it sounds like probably more than one time, that I compensate this week for this issue, and then the next week I'm beat up the other side. Like, to me, that sounds like you're letting the pendulum swing a little bit too far. And definitely, like, obviously we all know we've had to make adjustments, and we make adjustments a lot of times to be able to get some of the work in, but it's a matter of trying to dial in how far of a swing and adjustment can we make. Because obviously too much of an adjustment can have that bleed over effect into subsequent training, and it's not necessarily going to be something that's optimal, especially from a longevity standpoint. That might just be your body saying, hey, pay attention to me, this really fucking hurts, and you need to address this rather than putting more weight on the bar right now.
Yeah, and I think the off switch for me, the pressure valve, is when your focus shifts to the pain rather than trying to get the work done. In other words, when your focus shifts to trying to avoid the pain rather than trying to do correct technique or whatever, it's time to shut it down.
Yeah. Yeah, so I like that heuristic. That's something that I've noticed that I tend to do as well. Like it's an easier line, at least for me, to draw, because at the point where I'm no longer able to focus on applying force to the bar and I'm thinking about, oh, does my knee hurt? Does my knee hurt? It's not fun anymore anyway.
For sure. And I think that's definitely a good way to go about it, with a bit of a asterisk to that too, is that the person has to be in tune with themselves enough to know that. We all know different people have different pain thresholds, and I don't think we have different pain thresholds because my nerves are tougher than your nerves. I think we have different pain thresholds primarily because of how aware we are.
Yeah.
People have different body awareness of where their body is at in space.
Yeah, like the perceptual quality of pain is interesting, to say the least, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that definitely can vary from person to person, and that can vary for one person depending on where they're at in life.
Yeah.
So I think that plays into things too as well, which obviously who knows how deep that rabbit hole goes. I don't even know what it looks like going in there. I kind of understand a little bit of the entrance to that hole, but I don't know what the details are going down there.
Yeah, that's probably going to be another topic for another time. Rabbit hole is right, I don't know. It's also something I've been kind of mulling over a lot more lately. I would say in the last several months, just as people talk more and more about, graduated exposure, biopsychosocial pain models and things like that. There's a lot of interesting ideas if you kind of start with those starting points and just see where the rationality goes. But yeah, anyway, I won't get us too far off track for that, but maybe another conversation, right?
For sure. But that whole thing what you're saying there is that you get your sensitivity to the exposure reduces based on the exposure. So a seasoned lifter is going to be less likely to perceive that pain in a normal fashion if they're used to dealing with that all the time. So I think the more pain you're in, the more like used to it you get. And I think that happens to a lot of people.
Maybe. There's a feedback loop there too, like a sensitivity process that can happen. Like if you, like that's why they tell people now, don't rate your pain, don't keep a pain diary and things like that, because you're paying attention to it, and so you tend to pay attention to it. It kind of ramps up the perceived importance of it. So I definitely get what you're saying. I think it can cut in both directions though as well.
Yeah, because I would definitely not agree with the don't pay attention to it paradigm aspect. I would definitely say that the pain is there for a reason. It's there to tell us something about something that's going on, something we need to change, whether it be, training, something to change, adjust, if this hurts or that hurts.
I suppose I don't mean, maybe I said that badly. I don't mean don't pay attention to it as in ignore it. I mean, don't catastrophize it. Don't make it the center of your focus. That
Right. Okay.
it's a thing, it's a signal, but if it's over some threshold where you need to pay attention to it, you'll know it's not something that you need to rate and keep a diary and, oh, if it went up by 2 points, then does that mean a this or that? Like
right.
that,
You want to observe it, not evaluate it. You want to observe, oh, my knee hurts, not my knee hurts. It's going to blow out if I squat to depth.
yeah. I don't know. We're getting out of my depth here. Maybe we need to have Jordan back on and talk about this a bit more. But we're also making distinctions that I know myself. I may not be able to make distinctions like that. Like you just have implicit beliefs about what pain means. From prior experience. It's the normal way of learning about the world around you to some extent. So I would be that I guess my point is that may be harder to do than it seems to on its face.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, the I suppose one other thing that I wanted to mention about the Christos talk before we'll wrap this up. I asked him if he ever had a lifter that he worked with that seemed to be an extremely talented lifter, strong and good technique and everything, but just wasn't able to cope mentally with the stresses of maxing out every session. And he said, yeah, he had lifters like that. One in particular came to mind, who, was an extremely talented lifter. He felt like the guy could have gone to the Olympics. He had trained for a few years, but just ultimately couldn't maintain the program, and eventually he dropped out and became a chef. And that's the end of the story. So I thought that was interesting as well, right? Like that's like we tend to focus so much on individualizing training plans and just whole training approaches. I wondered if there was room for any of that or consequences to any of that in his program. Now, you say if they had taken a different approach, I wonder if it would have been as effective for the guy. Maybe never would have got to that level. But I mean, I think you're talking about a talented lifter, and talented lifters have risen to the top in a variety of systems. That's at least within the realm of possibility. I suppose again, like that's not necessarily the game that he was playing. Um, individualizing things for lifters, but I also wonder about that, right? Like you think like a collegiate strength coach is in a similar scenario in that he needs to make the team as a whole better. But I still think that there's a prominent role for individualizing your training process. That by making sure that each of the athletes are optimizing their own training process, then you're going to allow the most talented athletes to rise to the top in that way. That I mean, it's a little bit like shoehorning everybody into a low carb or ketogenic diet or whatever, and you say, well, such and such percentage of people just won't be able to comply with the diet. Like if they would have been able to comply, maybe, it would have been better, but they can't comply because they're unwilling to, or, however you want to define it, but they don't comply, so they don't get the benefit. I mean, it's the same thing to some extent with training, right? That you've got to right training. If your training system makes people quit, then it doesn't matter how good the training system is, You don't set any PRs if you're not competing.
For sure. My brain automatically wanders to the mental side of that stuff rather than the actual training itself. And that, because I mean, even depending on, I'm sure we've all seen it along the various different levels of athletics in our lifetime. Like you see it in some high school sports. I remember seeing some kids that were, really talented, and it's like, oh man, I hope they come out for the team this year, and they never did. And it's like, just because for whatever reason. But I think back to that, and I think a lot of it just has to do with not having, that mental drive for those things. For whatever reason is, who knows? But if somebody doesn't have that drive to put that work in and cope with that amount of work to improve.
Yeah, that mental disposition is part of being talented. That it's like saying, hey, you could have been a great lifter, but you don't have any muscles. Like, it's kind of essential, So
Right.
kind of what you're saying is that, we think of the mentality as being infinitely plastic, and anybody can do it if they just want to, but maybe not, that there's a component of talent that applies there as well.
There's definitely a component of talent, but also like just that motivational drive, that mental drive to just do it.
Do you think that that's something that's within our sphere of control?
I believe that 100% up to the individual, but I think that there are things that coaches could do to give a person tools to do that, to become that, or become at least better at it than they currently are.
One thing I've noticed in the past is some lifters that like the idea of being a power lifter, but then when they really get into the meat of it, they discover that they don't really, it's different than, they like the idea of being themselves being a power lifter, but then when they actually are a power lifter, it's not really, doesn't suit them very well.
It's not what they'd imagine.
Yeah, it might be, say, way too much work, too time consuming, etc.
Yeah. I mean,
and
we definitely know that powerlifting is that. It is a lot of work, and it's time consuming for sure, yeah. Sorry, I kind of jumped in there, Mark. Where are you going with that?
Well, just the whole mental aspect, like Ross was talking about. I think I've always looked at it like there's the physical part and there's the mental part. The mental part is huge. And yes, I agree. We can give our athletes tools to help deal with the mental part, but that long, slow, hard grind, that's what it is. It's just hundreds of thousands of pounds lifted every year. And if you're not willing to do that, or you don't understand that that's what it takes, you're not gonna last you might last a few years, and then you're going to say, hey, I want to do something else.
See, this is interesting to me because I automatically connect it back to the personality investigation that we looked at. So among high-level, long-term powerlifters, which we'd surveyed 100 and some odd of those, we noticed that extroversion and agreeableness were bang on average. So there doesn't seem to be a big selection pressure on extroversion and agreeableness. I already mentioned that neuroticism was low. Conscientiousness was high. So your ability to kind of adhere to the program and keep going even when you don't want to, and go to the gym because you said that you were going to go to the gym, not necessarily because it's the most fun thing to do right now. That was high. I forget the actual score, but it was, the second strongest trait, in terms of deviation from the average. So conscientiousness was high. And then openness was a little bit low, not crazy low, but just a little bit low. And what you notice in low openness people is that they tend to be a little bit more routine oriented. They crave novelty a little bit less, and it wasn't crazy, but I think kind of this combination, you notice, okay, a little bit low openness, so a little bit of a preference toward routine, high conscientiousness, willing to continue to work, even, continue to put in work for a long-term payoff, and low neuroticism. So they tend to feel a little bit less anxiety, a little bit less stress, a little bit less of the ups and downs of things. When you kind of take those three traits as kind of mental characteristics of long-term powerlifters, I think that's interesting, and that resonates to me, at least, as far as most powerlifters that I've met. Now, what's interesting to me, and what I would love to know, and hopefully someday we'll be able to figure this out, is, does powerlifting merely select for those types of people? Meaning, if you've got it, then you stay in powerlifting, and if you ain't got it, then you quit. Or does powerlifting develop those qualities? Meaning, you start out wherever you start out, but because you powerlift, you get better at being conscientious, or your neuroticism goes down. I would love to know that.
My sense of it is that I'm guessing that the personality traits are in place, and powerlifting is a result of that, because those are the type of people that would be drawn to powerlifting and stick with it.
Let me frame the question a little bit differently then, Mark. Do you think that, so you've been training for a lot of years now, do you think training has made you a better person?
Yes, I think training is definitely. I mean, I think there's a lot of lessons in powerlifting that can be applied directly to life situations. But has powerlifting increased those personality qualities that you mentioned earlier? I don't think so.
No.
Maybe some. Maybe it's strengthened them some.
Yeah, I mean that's probably the most likely outcome, right? That both things are in effect. That, yeah, powerlifting, doing any sort of long-term disciplined activity would have some sort of an effect on your personality given enough time. But also, you kind of got to start, like, it's not going to give you a 180. You're not going to start off being a total flake and then turn into being a regimen warrior by by committing to powerlifting for a few years, right? So maybe both things are in play. All right, guys. I know Ross. Well, we all probably got to get back to coaching here. So appreciate you guys sitting around and having a chat with me about this. It's a good conversation, a lot of fun. So thanks, guys. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.
Reactive training systems.